Eklanete, Dene Sotlene Eriel Tsaekwe Hushe, Deranger Betsiani Hesli. My name is Eriel Tsaekwe Deranger, and I just want to start by acknowledging that I too am a visitor in this territory. So I am from Treaty 8 territory. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, and we are in Treaty 6, Amiskwichis Waskayagan. And I just want to recognize that this is Cree territory, and I am Dene. So if I butchered Amiskwichis Waskayagan, I apologize because I am not Cree. So I want to start by first acknowledging the fact that Canada and its entire structure is built off of the premise of extractivism and extraction of the land away from Indigenous populations and removing Indigenous peoples from the lands and territories in which we've occupied since time immemorial. And the territories of this country were occupied by the Maliseet, the Innu, the Labrador Inuit, the Algonquin, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, and various different types of Cree, and many different types of Dene people, and the Haida Gwaii, and the Nishka, and the Nocholnith, and many of the Coast Salish communities in British Columbia. And we all came with our unique cultures, languages, governance, education styles, and ways of knowing and being in relation to our lands and territories. But Indigenous peoples aren't just here in Canada. So Indigenous peoples represent about 5% of the global population, or 370 million people worldwide. That represents over 5,000 distinct groups in over 90 different countries. And each one of those groups has their own language, governance, education, and ways of knowing and being in relation to the lands in which they have come from. This is represented and demonstrated by the fact that Indigenous peoples the world over, while we only represent 5% of the global population, we occupy and use between 22 and 65% of the land surface, depending on who's calculating this. There's a lot of disputes around it. And in that land surface, it represents about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So 80% of the world's biodiversity exists within Indigenous lands and territories the world over. And what's really interesting is that 85% of the world's protection and conservation zones exist within Indigenous lands and territories or adjacent to. But what's really alarming is while we represent such a very large number of land use and biodiversity, Indigenous peoples represent about 15% of the world's poor. So we're only 5% of the global population, but if you take the representation of the world's poor, it's Indigenous peoples. So when we think about Canada, just to frame it back here, we're really talking about, so Sustainable Goal 15, let me back up a bit. So Sustainable Goal 15 is about protecting, restoring, and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managing forests, combating desertification, and halting and reversing land degradation and halting biodiversity loss. So let's look at Canada for a second. So we have the world over Indigenous peoples, 80% of the biodiversity, and we're going to talk about land management here in this country. So we often think of Canada as a country that is developed through a treaty-making process. There have even been documentaries that say we are all treaty people. And these treaties were supposed to be agreements to share and utilize the land of this country. And there are numbered treaties between 1 and 11. There's various other forms of treaties, but there are also various large tracts of Canada that are untreated, meaning that no agreements were made on how to manage and utilize those lands and territories. This includes tracts within British Columbia, the Yukon, almost the entire Yukon Territory, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador. And so much of those territories are untreated, meaning that there has been no agreements to manage those lands and territories. And we often see these maps of Canada with all the treaties, and they're quite large tracts. In fact, Treaty 8, that I'm a member of, is the largest area-wise treaty area in the country. But when you look at what's actually happened, is that Indigenous peoples have lost the ability to manage our lands and territories. When you look at a map that's not the treaty territories, but just of the reserve plots of the country, it only represents 0.2% of the landmass. So 0.2% of the landmass is where we are given jurisdiction and control and management of our lands and territories. That is it. The other 99.8% of the land is classified as Crown land, and the federal government has ultimate say over the control and management of our lands and territories. So there has been this complete devolution of how Indigenous peoples are being regarded as managers and resource controllers of our own lands and territories. And I think it's really important for you to understand that as Indigenous peoples, these lands and territories that we often fight for, that we often get into disputes with governments over resource management, over management of species, water, and so on and so forth, are not just places that we're fighting for resources. These places are a part of our identity. They are intrinsically linked to who we are as Indigenous peoples. As a Dene woman, a Dene Sotlene woman, when you take the word Dene and you break it down into its root words, it means to flow from the land or to flow from the earth. The lands and territories in which we have lived since time immemorial, they are our kitchens and our grocery stores. They are our pharmacies. They are our schools and educational institutes. They are our churches. They are the places where we go for our cultural and recreational uses. They are a part of who we are. They are connected to who we are. When I grew up, I was taught that from the blade of grass to a pebble on the ground to the rivers that flows to the trees and the sky and the air and the sun and the moon and the stars and all the animals that occupy this planet are my brothers and sisters. They are my relations. I'm related to everything, and we have a place in these places in which we have existed. These places have nurtured who we are from our very core genetics to our spiritual and emotional well-being. And yet, we have been robbed of our ability to manage our lands and territories. Yet we have also modeled some of the most low-carbon and sustainable lifeways since time immemorial. So, while many Indigenous communities now face intractable poverty, despite the fact that we live on resource-rich lands, and it's because our rights are not respected and our rights to self-determination and development is not supported. And that came from Victoria Tallis Corpus, who works with Tebteba and was the former UN Rapporteur on Indigenous rights. And when it comes to sustainable development goals, we wonder, a lot of people ask, well, where are Indigenous peoples involved with the sustainable development goals? So there are 17 sustainable development goals in the 2030 agenda. And of those 17 goals, there are 169 targets. Of those, 92% are closely linked to human rights. 73 out of the 169 targets have substantial links to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And a key entry point for Indigenous peoples in the 2030 agenda is the agenda's strong commitments to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. Again, 5% of the global population, 15% of the global people in poverty. As Indigenous people across the world still lag behind on most social, economic, and political indicators, they should be at the heart of the implementation of the 2030 agenda, particularly life on land, and many of the other agendas, because we have demonstrated some of the most sustainable land practices the world over. At the UN Rio 20 Plus Summit, in the outcome document, The Future We Want, they stated that the importance, or recognized the importance of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the achievement of sustainable development and the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the context of global, regional, national, and subnational implementation of sustainable development strategies. It's absolutely imperative that we move forward in respecting the rights of Indigenous communities. Colonization and the formation of the states resulted in historical injustices committed against Indigenous peoples through forced assimilation, implementation of discriminatory law and policies and practices, imposition of elite democracy, authoritarian rule, and exploitive economic economies. Indigenous peoples to this day still experience marginalization, exclusion, and disempowerment. This historical fact of the development injustice should be fully acknowledged and addressed at a starting point for the inclusion and empower Indigenous people in achieving the SDGs. The prior iteration, the Millennium Development Goals, did not include Indigenous peoples in the development of those goals and actually led to the further marginalization of Indigenous peoples. When we talk about uplifting and upholding the unique rights of Indigenous peoples as defined by the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, sometimes there's some questions as to what is the difference between human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples? And it's a very simple answer. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights was created and passed in 1946. One of our previous speakers said that Indigenous peoples could not even raise money or go to court or go to challenge systems until 1961. We couldn't vote in Canada until 1960. And even prior to that, we were classified under Flora and Fauna Acts, immigration laws, and we did not, in fact, have the same human rights. We were not recognized as humans in many states the world over. In many countries like Australia, Indigenous peoples were classified simply as flora and fauna, and you could literally kill, molest, do whatever you wanted to, and there would be no repercussions because you were not, in fact, hurting another human being. The other fact of the matter is in 1946, when this was all created, Indigenous peoples weren't classified as humans, so they weren't involved in this. And the UN Declaration of Human Rights looks at our individual rights and freedoms, looks to protect your rights, your rights, your rights, your rights as individuals, which we need. We absolutely need. But Indigenous peoples and communities function in collectives. We function in a collective partnerships with each other, where we each have a role to play, and we also have a collective relationship, not just with each other as humans, but with the natural world. And that is clearly defined within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which puts us in a really, really critical role in helping us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So much so that part of this process has resulted in the development of the Indigenous Peoples Major Working Group for Sustainable Development, where they're working to ensure that Indigenous rights are effectively addressed through all parts of the Sustainable Development Goals. There have been many recommendations in all aspects from 1 to 17, except for Goal 7, which looks at affordable and clean energy and life below water. Probably because Indigenous people don't live below water, but we often have relationships with many of the species, so I'm not sure why. And life on land has a very small amount of recommendations, and the biggest goal with the most recommendation is the peace and justice and strong institutions. Does anyone know why that might be? Well, it's because Indigenous peoples face the most criminalization for standing up and trying to advocate for their rights and the protection of their lands and territories. Is anyone familiar with what's going on in Wet'suwet'en territory right now? One hand, two hands. So the Wet'suwet'en clans are a group of clans located in interior British Columbia that are currently fighting for the protection and preservation of their ecosystems in inland British Columbia. And they are asserting that you cannot build a pipeline, a liquid natural gas pipeline through their territories because it would fragment their territories and put their territories at risk. And they are being criminalized. The RCMP are being utilized to come in and remove them from their own traditional lands and territories. I just want to recognize that these are non-treaty territories in British Columbia. And this is in a country with high human rights standards. So imagine what happens to Indigenous peoples that live in the Philippines, that live in Taiwan, that live in the Congo. The human rights abuses are immense. In fact, the criminalization of Indigenous peoples the world over has resulted in there have been 472 killings of Indigenous peoples between 2017 and 2019, 423 arbitrary detentions, 237 illegal arrests, and 1,630 threats and threats on people's lives between 2017 and 2019. So in a 2-year period, this is what has been happening to Indigenous peoples. I just want to say 472 Indigenous peoples the world over have been killed. Killed fighting for the protection and preservation of their lands and territories, almost in every single case, fighting unsustainable development of their lands and territories. Even in Canada right now, we have a government and a prime minister that has said no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. And he's talking about the Alberta oil sands. So much so that we have now gone ahead and bought a tar sands pipeline that will ship Alberta's oil to market. And this is the Trans Mountain pipeline. And today, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed a case from Indigenous peoples stating that they did not feel that they were consulted adequately. And the Supreme Court said that Indigenous peoples cannot veto these projects. So we have a system that does not respect and uphold our unique rights, and those rights are intrinsically connected to our lands and territories. Again, I just want to state, 5% of the global population, 80% of the biodiversity that's left on this planet. We are faced with an incredible climate crisis right now, where we have to do whatever it takes to ensure that our lands and territories and our ecosystems and biodiversity are protected for future generations. It is Indigenous communities that continue to rise up and challenge these systems of false protection of our biodiversity, false solutions, and asking for more protections, not just of our rights as Indigenous peoples, but the preservation of our lands and territories. Currently, right now in this province, we have the largest ever proposed oil sands mine, the Tech Frontier mine, being proposed and considered by the federal government for approval, has already gone through a provincial review or a joint review panel process that said that the project should be approved, but Cabinet gets to make a decision. This project will disturb 29,000 hectares of land. That's 2 times the size of Vancouver. It will disturb critical habitat for caribou and bison and other species at risk, including being within the pathway of the last remaining wild whooping cranes on the planet. This project will withdraw major water from the water systems in the Athabasca River system. It will create 6 megatons of emissions annually into the atmosphere, further exacerbating climate change. And it is grassroots communities downstream, like the Smith's Landing First Nation, that is considered not impacted because they are too geographically far away. Yet those river systems run northward. And that water and that contamination and the air and the pollution absolutely affects them. And so right now they're asking for people to stand up in solidarity with these communities to ask for more sustainable management, more rigorous review processes to include downstream communities, and ultimately they're asking for control over their lands and territories. There is a budding movement in Canada called Land Back. And some people go, what does that even mean, land back? Communities are saying in order for us not just to achieve economic equity in this country, but to ensure that our rights are protected and that we have a safe and stable climate for future generations, Indigenous peoples must be given their lands and territories back into their hands. And that is exactly what the Wet'suwet'en are fighting for by introducing their Indigenous laws and governance. This is what we are doing while we continue to stand up to challenge one of the largest open pit mines in the country. And we are saying that we must go beyond truth and reconciliation, that we must honor and respect that Indigenous peoples have modeled some of the most low carbon lifestyles since time immemorial. And lastly, we must move towards decolonizing how we effectively address not just things at the international, national, and regional level, but we must decolonize the way in which we relate to each other and to the land. And decolonization in its basic form, is about the return of and the connections to land. We must move towards decolonizing our minds and our relationships with each other. And remember that Indigenous peoples, our culture, our values, our languages, and our knowledge connect us to the sacredness of Mother Earth. Our voices and solutions are critical to developing solutions and strategies that will benefit everyone. Thank you. Masicho. Hi, hi.